A black woman walked into a luxury jet showroom. They thought she was lost. She signed a $4 million deal in under 10 minutes. No suit, no assistant, no apology. They judged her by her skin. She answered with her legacy. Are you ready for this story? Before we begin, let me know where you are watching from. They didn't see a threat when she walked in. They saw a mistake. A woman with gray streaks in her braid and brown skin, weathered by sun and time, stepped into a private jet showroom in El Paso with a woven shawl and dust on her heels. The salesman looked past her like she was a janitor who'd taken a wrong turn. She didn't blink. She didn't apologize. She said 8 words that broke the air in half. I'm here to buy the Aerolux C9. Silence. You could hear the hum of money stop, just like that. No one knew she'd built a textile empire with her bare hands, from a backyard loom and a mother who was once told she'd never belong in America's boardrooms. But today, her name would enter rooms no one could keep her out of. They'd remember the woman they tried to overlook, and they'd never look the same again. They saw a shadow walk in, brown-skinned, silver-braided, wrapped in a hand-woven shawl, not a stitch of silk or leather in sight. Dust clung to her hem like memory. Her sandals tapped against the cold tile of the showroom floor, echoing like something sacred and out of place. The hangar wasn't built for women like her, not in their eyes. Not for someone with calloused fingers and eyes that had seen loss, fire, and the underside of promise. They didn't see her walk in with a purpose. They saw her interrupt a world that wasn't meant to be interrupted. One man stepped before her, gently stroking her toward the waiting area. Deliveries are through the back, ma'am, he offered, kind enough to be cruel. She looked at him, not with anger, not even defiance, but with the stillness that makes men nervous. That stillness lives in people who've had to wait, bite their tongues too often, and bury too many dreams in silence. I'm not here to deliver, she said. I'm here to purchase. No one moved. The words didn't shout, but they landed like thunder rolling low across the desert. In that moment, 1,000 stories lived behind her eyes. The humiliation her mother carried when they were refused a loan in 1971 was not because the books weren't right, but because of her accent. When her uncle was passed over for a construction contract, he bid the lowest because the client didn't trust Spanish crews. The countless sideways glances she had endured, dressed in tradition among men who valued polish more than principle. But this time, she would not explain herself. She wouldn't open her books or list her credentials. She would let their assumptions do the work, and then let reality undo it. That, she had learned, was more effective than any speech. They expected her to be lost, or looking, or asking. They didn't expect her to own the future sitting on the tarmac outside. This wasn't a scene about money, though she had it. It wasn't about status, though she had earned that too. This was about something more profound, something that touched the marrow of what it means to be seen, or not seen, in a country that promises equal ground, but too often offers split-level footing. She didn't want to brag. She needed it to scale what she'd built with her bare hands, a textile business rooted in culture, craftsmanship, and quiet rebellion. She'd shipped by truck, by rail, by whatever was possible. But now her buyers waited in Berlin, Tokyo, and New York, and she was done waiting for the world to catch up. The jet wasn't luxurious. It was leverage. And if she had to walk through a dozen marble-floored rooms and endure a dozen more thin smiles and raised brows to get it, so be it. She'd walked through worse, because she knew something the polished men in that hangar hadn't figured out yet. Dignity doesn't announce itself. It walks in quietly, wearing dust and memory, and says, "I belong here." And when it does, the world has no choice but to listen. They said her mother would never amount to much. Not in West Texas, not in the 70s, not speaking English with a thick lilt from Oaxaca, wearing braids, pride, and cotton skirts too plain for city rooms. Elena Morales had hands that spun thread with patience and patterns born from stories older than this country. She didn't ask for permission. She asked for a table at the market and was told more than once that her booth wasn't modern enough, that her accent might confuse customers, that she could sell behind the store, maybe not in front. So she opened a shack behind their house, built shelves from leftover fence posts, and hung finished fabrics on clotheslines, praying the wind wouldn't carry them off before the neighbors saw. Delilah grew up watching her mother get turned away from spaces she knew she deserved to be in. But she never saw her mother beg. She saw her build. Every stitch was a protest, a prayer, and a promise. And that promise didn't end with Elena Morales. Delilah didn't inherit a fortune. She inherited a reason and a legacy. She remembered the nights they stayed up past midnight dyeing threads in tin pots, the smell of herbs and heat clinging to the air. She remembered how her mother cried quietly once when a boutique in Santa Fe returned all her fabrics without a note. But most of all, she remembered the last thing her mother told her before she died. "They'll always make space for you after you no longer need it. So build it before they say yes." So she did. She went from selling hand-woven table runners out of her trunk to securing her first statewide deal by age 38. She hired her first employee at 41. Monroe Weaves wasn't just a business by 50. It was a sanctuary. A place where craft met commerce, where women who'd been told their labor was a hobby now earned a living wage. But she never let the mission stray. No matter how many orders came in from Brooklyn or Berlin, she ensured the story stayed stitched into the fabric. The labels still bore her mother's name. The showroom still smelled of sage and mesquite. The payroll still included the same women who started on day one, hands steady, backs bent, pride unshaken. Because for Delilah, profit meant nothing without purpose. Success was not a crown. It was a bridge. The jet she came to buy wasn't a trophy. It was a vessel for the weight of generations, for the voices never allowed in boardrooms, for the stories woven into every yard of cloth she shipped worldwide. And if she had to walk through doors that slammed on her mother to open them wider for the women behind her, then so be it. She had become what her mother dreamed of, but never got to see. A woman who didn't ask to be invited in, but came to own the building. When people asked how she did it, she never said luck. She said, thread by thread, pain by purpose, generation by generation. And that was how she knew. Even if the money vanished, the legacy wouldn't. Because real inheritance isn't what you leave behind, it's what you live out loud, so no one has to whisper again. They didn't see her coming, not because she was quiet, but because they had trained their eyes only to recognize power in one form. And Delilah Monroe didn't fit it. She didn't stride with a briefcase or drop names like business cards. She didn't wear heels tall enough to intimidate or speak with the polished cadence of a Harvard seminar. She strolled the way people walk when they're not performing, when they know who they are and what they carry. And what she carried was this. She was a woman of color in America who no longer asked for permission. For decades, power in boardrooms, on magazine covers, behind corporate decisions, had looked the same. Suits in gray and blue, skin pale, voices smooth from generations of knowing they belonged. Delilah had none of that. She had brown skin, an accent touched by desert roots, and hands that bore the memory of loom and labor. Yet, here she stood, out-earning, outlasting, and outmaneuvering them, without ever having to become one of them, because the rules they'd written were never designed for her. And instead of waiting to be invited to play by their rules, she rewrote the game. She redefined what leadership looked like, not from a podium, but from the quiet consistency of hiring women no one else would, building a dignity-based supply chain, and saying no to exploitation disguised as globalization. She made decisions with her soul and spreadsheets. She didn't need validation. She had vision. And that terrified them. Not because she was loud, but because she was undeniable. One executive once told her, off the record, "Your business model is inspiring, but it's not scalable." She smiled. 6 months later, her fabrics walked the runways of Paris. Another investor told her, "Your story is beautiful, but markets don't buy sentiment." She nodded. Then she signed a 3-year exclusive deal with a luxury interiors brand in New York that wanted authentic stories woven into every piece. Every time someone doubted her because of how she looked, how she spoke, or where she came from, she let their doubt work for her. Not out of spite, but strategy. Because the more they underestimated her, the more space she had to move. And while they were busy doubting, she was building. The jet? That was just a chapter. The real story was in the ripple she created simply by existing in spaces where women like her had never been expected to survive, let alone lead. She didn't just occupy space. She owned it, gracefully, relentlessly, and unapologetically. And perhaps the most potent part? She never claimed to be special. She knew thousands more like her, women who'd been silenced, side-eyed, or passed over. She wasn't the exception. She was just the first one they couldn't ignore. So when she walked into that showroom, dust on her sandals and legacy in her stride, she didn't just buy a jet. She bought back a piece of the sky for every woman who had been told to stay grounded. And now that she'd taken off, there was no landing back in the old world again. They didn't see her coming, not because she was quiet, but because they had trained their eyes only to recognize power in one form. And Delilah Monroe didn't fit it. She didn't stride with a briefcase or drop names like business cards. She didn't wear heels tall enough to intimidate or speak with the polished cadence of a Harvard seminar. She strolled the way people walk when they're not performing, when they know who they are and what they carry. And what she carried was this. She was a woman of color in America who no longer asked for permission. For decades, power in boardrooms, on magazine covers, behind corporate decisions, had looked the same. Suits in gray and blue, skin pale, voices smooth from generations of knowing they belonged. Delilah had none of that. She had brown skin, an accent touched by desert roots, and hands that bore the memory of loom and labor. Yet, here she stood, out-earning, outlasting, and outmaneuvering without ever having to become one of them. Because the rules they'd written were never designed for her. And instead of waiting to be invited to play by their rules, she rewrote the game. She redefined what leadership looked like, not from a podium, but from the quiet consistency of hiring women no one else would, building a dignity-based supply chain, and saying no to exploitation disguised as globalization. She made decisions with her soul and spreadsheets. She didn't need validation. She had vision. And that terrified them. Not because she was loud, but because she was undeniable. One executive once told her, off the record, "Your business model is inspiring, but it's not scalable." She smiled. 6 months later, her fabrics walked the runways of Paris. Another investor told her, Your story is beautiful, but markets don't buy sentiment. She nodded. Then she signed a 3-year exclusive deal with a luxury interiors brand in New York that wanted authentic stories woven into every piece. Every time someone doubted her because of how she looked, how she spoke, or where she came from, she let their doubt work for her. Not out of spite, but strategy. Because the more they underestimated her, the more space she had to move. And while they were busy doubting, she was building. The jet? That was just a chapter. The real story was in the ripple she created simply by existing in spaces where women like her had never been expected to survive, let alone lead. She didn't just occupy space, she owned it, gracefully, relentlessly, and unapologetically. And perhaps the most potent part. She never claimed to be special. She knew thousands more like her, women who'd been silenced, side-eyed, or simply passed over. She wasn't the exception. She was just the first one they couldn't ignore. So when she walked into that showroom, dust on her sandals and legacy in her stride, she didn't just buy a jet. She bought back a piece of the sky for every woman who had been told to stay grounded. And now that she'd taken off, there was no landing back in the old world again. She didn't plan to speak. Not at first. Delilah had come to the hangar for one thing. A transaction. Efficient. Professional. Clean. Through hard-earned years, she had learned to command a room without raising her voice and move through spaces without making waves. Until she needed to. But some moments ask more of us. They demand we pause. They demand we turn. She noticed the girl before anyone else did, standing near the service counter in a borrowed blazer, holding a resume that trembled ever so slightly in her hand. Young, maybe 23, with dark eyes full of fire, doubt, and the quiet ache of someone trying not to shrink. Her name tag read Lucia. Delilah watched the exchange from across the room. Lucia spoke quickly and respectfully. The manager listened, then shook his head with that measured politeness that always feels worse than outright rejection. Something about not the right profile. Something about experience. Something about nothing. Delilah had heard it all before. In different tones, different rooms, the same result. So she walked over. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but unignorable. The manager turned, startled. "I couldn't help but overhear," she continued. "This young woman's asking for an apprenticeship, and you're telling her, what exactly?" "Well," he stammered, "we typically look for applicants with more technical background, or recommendations, and—" Delilah raised a brow. Not rude, not angry, just steady. "And how does one get a technical background without a chance to earn it?" Lucia blinked. The room stilled. Delilah didn't grandstand. She didn't make a scene. She turned to Lucia and said, "Come to my factory this Saturday. We'll talk. We run aircraft logistics now. Maybe there's something for you to learn, and something we can learn from you." That was it. Nothing more. No drama. Just a door, cracked open. Lucia showed up that Saturday, early, prepared, determined. She asked good questions. She stayed late. She listened. And 3 months later, she earned a spot in a national aviation tech training program with a recommendation letter signed by Delilah Monroe, CEO. Not charity, not pity. Belief. And that belief did something more profound than give Lucia a shot. It gave her proof that someone like her, from her street, with her name, could belong in an industry that rarely looked like her. It taught her that success isn't just about rising, it's about reaching back. Delilah knew this. She'd lived it. She never forgot what it felt like to be overlooked. But more importantly, she never forgot the rare moments when someone hadn't overlooked her. Those were the moments that built everything. And in helping Lucia, she wasn't just doing a good deed. She was planting a flag. She was saying, "We're here. We're capable. We're next." And more than that, we'll bring others with us. Because what's the point of flying if the runway's only built for one? Delilah Monroe didn't speak to impress. She never needed to. She had learned long ago that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one doing the most. And for women like her, brown-skinned, working class, speaking English, layered with the music of another land, noise was often mistaken for arrogance. Silence, on the other hand, gave her room to move. So she made silence her strategy, and timing her weapon. When the young salesman at the hangar smirked at her purchase mention, she didn't rattle off numbers. She didn't flash a business card or drop credentials. She let his assumptions hang in the air, heavy and predictable. Then, when the moment was right, she offered a sentence that would stay with him far longer than a speech. "I built a $14 million company from my mother's loom. No theatrics, no anger, just truth, clear, precise, and impossible to argue with." It hit harder than any raised voice ever could. Because absolute power doesn't need to perform. It walks in quietly, dressed in humility and results, and shifts the air by being there. For decades, Delilah had watched others climb by shouting, branding, broadcasting. And yet, she'd built her empire from fabric and faith without needing applause. She'd let her product speak, let her clients return, let her employees stay, because dignity travels farther than marketing. Some might say she should have shouted more, taken and taken Jay, and claimed her space louder. But Delilah knew something many spend a lifetime chasing. Validation is borrowed. Conviction is owned. So when she left that hangar, the jet contract was signed, Lucia's opportunity was secured, and a few quiet minds forever changed. She didn't celebrate. She got back to work, because to her, that moment wasn't about proving anything. It was just time. She didn't win by being louder. She won by showing up, staying steady, and choosing her moment well. And in that, she reminded the world, success doesn't always knock. Sometimes it whispers. And when it does, you'd better be listening. Now here's the question for you. Have you ever been underestimated because you were quiet, only to prove more by doing than by saying? Share your story in the comments. Someone out there needs to hear it. Delilah Monroe never wanted to be in charge, not in the way people usually mean it. She didn't care for corner offices, titles on doors, or applause after meetings. Leadership for her was never about control. It was about care. She'd grown up under a roof where meals were stretched, fabric scraps became clothes, and generosity wasn't something you gave when you had plenty. You gave when you had enough to share. So when Monroe Weaves began to grow, first 2 workers, then 10, then 30, Delilah didn't see herself as a boss. She saw herself as a steward, builder of bridges, not walls. She knew every employee's name. She knew which aunt taught them to weave, who needed Friday afternoons off for chemo visits, and whose son was saving for trade school. Her leadership didn't come from above. It stood beside. When people asked how she retained workers in an industry drowning in turnover, her answer was always the same. Because no one wants to leave a place where they feel seen. Delilah believed leadership was measured not by how many people followed her, but by how many people she could lift higher than herself. It showed how she mentored Lucia, not with lectures, but with quiet trust. It showed how she handed over decision-making power to her staff leads, letting them vote on logistics, wages, and who got promoted. And most of all, it showed how she trained her daughter Isabella. Fierce and brilliant Isabella returned from college full of metrics and ambition. She wanted to digitize everything, scale faster, and modernize aggressively. Delilah listened. Then she handed her a spool of yarn. "Run this through your fingers," she said. "Tell me what it feels like." Isabella did, then paused. "It feels human." Delilah smiled. "Don't ever forget that. Behind every data point is a person. Lead them like you'd want to be led if you lost everything but your dignity." That was the lesson she lived by, and it became the legacy she left behind. Delilah Monroe built something older, wiser, and stronger in a world obsessed with profit margins and growth hacks. She didn't lead with pressure. She led with presence. The proof was not in her earnings, but in the people around her who stood taller, spoke clearly, and believed in themselves more because she had believed in them first. Ultimately, her true power wasn't that she ran a successful business. It was that she made others believe they could too. Delilah Monroe didn't believe in final words. She believed in final actions, the kind that didn't need explaining, the type that whispered louder than applause. When people asked what she wanted to be remembered for, she'd shrug and say, "I don't need to be remembered. I need the work to outlive me." And it did. Her factory floor, once just a dusty garage with a humming loom, became a place where young women wrote their futures in thread and color. Once told their craft was outdated, her workers found their fabrics gracing Manhattan lofts and Milan studios. Her daughter Isabella didn't just inherit a company. She inherited a compass forged in patience and purpose. Delilah never raised her voice in protest. She raised opportunities. She didn't push open doors with fury. She built new ones with her bare hands and invited others in. The people who underestimated her only once. Because after that, the silence said enough. She never needed validation. She needed impact. Not the kind you put in headlines, but the kind that shows up in places you'll never see. A girl who dares to speak up in an interview. A woman who negotiates her worth without apology. A team that builds something real without asking if it's trendy. Delilah's legacy wasn't stitched into her logo or etched on a building. It was alive in people, quiet, brave, and rising. That's the truth about real legacy. It doesn't wear out. It wears on. You don't measure it in assets. You measure it in actions. You don't pass it down. You live it forward. Delilah wrote a letter in the last weeks before her retirement, not to her board or shareholders, but to her team. In it, she said, "I built this business not to prove anything to the world, but to unlearn everything the globe tried to prove that I wasn't enough, that we weren't meant to lead, that dignity must wait its turn. We don't need louder voices. We need clearer hands. Let your work speak, let your actions teach, and let your presence, just your presence, be the reason someone else feels they belong." And with that, she stepped back. No fanfare, no ceremony, just the sound of looms still humming, women still weaving, and a sky finally open, because someone like her refused to stay grounded. Maybe the story of Delilah Monroe isn't just about her. Maybe it's about all of us, anyone who's ever been looked at and silently dismissed. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't raise her voice. She just showed up and did the work so well that no one could ignore her. That's power. Quiet, steady, undeniable. So let me ask you, what would you do if no one believed in you? Would you wait for approval? Or would you prove them wrong, one action at a time? Tell us. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. If this story moved you, share it. Someone in your life needs to hear this today. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories that awaken, challenge, and inspire. Thank you for being here. And thank you for listening.